Stand with me as we honor the Word of God in its reading, the book of 1 Samuel chapter 8. We will begin with verse 4 and continue through verse 22. The Bible says the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, "Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint us a king to judge us like all the nations." But the matter was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people regarding all that they say to you, because they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have abandoned me and served other gods, so they are doing to you as well. Now then, listen to their voice, however. You shall warn them strongly and tell them of the practice of the king who will reign over them." So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked him for a king. And he said, "This will be the practice of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and put them in his chariots for himself and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and some to do his plowing and to gather in his harvest, and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters and use them as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. And he will take a tenth of your seed and your vineyards and give it to his high officials and his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out on that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you on that day." Yet the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. And they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, so that we also may be like all the nations, and our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." Now after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the Lord's hearing. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to their voice and appoint a king for them." You may be seated. The founding fathers of this nation believe that the Bible has a lot to say about government and those who govern. In a 10-year study conducted by the Political Science Department of the University of Houston, researchers collected 15,000 of writings by the founders to ascertain the source of their ideas. According to the study, the researchers selected 3,152 pieces that they believe had the greatest impact on America's founding. They discovered that the three men most quoted by the founders were Sir William Blackstone, Baron Montesquieu, and John Locke. The researchers were shocked, however, to discover that the Bible was quoted 16 times more often than these three men. In fact, 34% of all the quotes by the founders were taken straight from Scripture. Furthermore, another 60% of the founders' quotes were quotations of men who had quoted the Bible. In total, 94% of the founders' quotes came either directly or indirectly from God's Word. The Bible is filled with insights about human government and those who govern. One of the most fascinating passages is found in 1 Samuel 8, which we read moments ago. Now, to this particular point in Israeli history, the Hebrew people were ruled by no man, but by God alone. They had prophets to settle personal and national disputes, and they had judges to lead them in times of international crisis. When the crisis ended, the judges and the people went home to their families and their businesses. They had no standing army, no Congress, and no taxes. It was just the people, the prophet, the interim judges, and God. It was a system that worked amazingly well. That's why the request of the Israeli elders in verse 5 of 1 Samuel 8 is so astonishing. Notice the last part of that verse again. Appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. Even more astonishing, especially to those who reside in a society where government takes center stage, is the discovery of Samuel's displeasure with their request. That's in verse 6. More astonishing still is that 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 17 reveals that God looked upon their request to be ruled by human government as great wickedness. Now, the rifle shot of 1 Samuel 8 is found in God's instruction to Samuel in verse 9. Warn them strongly and tell them of the practice of the king who will reign over them. So God wanted His people to measure the far-ranging and far-reaching implications of their request. God wanted to place in full view of the Israelis the tendencies of human government. I want to highlight two of those tendencies on this July the 4th weekend for the simple reason that the truth found in 1 Samuel 8 remains applicable today. Prepare to be astounded. First, God says that human government has a tendency to take. Look at verse 11. This will be the practice of the king who will reign over you. He will take. He will take. He will take. The word take actually means to seize or to plunder. It was used in the Old Testament in association with illegal appropriation. In verses 11 through 17, this word appears no fewer than 15 times. 6 times explicitly, 9 times implicitly. The government has a tendency to take. In fact, throughout the course of history, taking is easily discerned as the overwhelming activity of government. By the time you pay federal taxes, Social Security taxes, Medicaid taxes, state taxes, local taxes, property taxes, road use taxes, toll taxes, sales taxes, garbage assessments, along with a mountain load of various licenses and fees, the average percentage of income that goes to the government in this nation via taxes is 43% on the low side and 58% on the high side. So let's assume for a moment that the lower figure is correct. That means that we, as individuals, have to work more than 5 months, January through the first week of June, before we are done paying the government each year. If the higher figure is correct, then everything we earn through the third week of July goes to the government. If we underpay our annual taxes by more than 10%, then the government will not only charge interest on what we fail to pay, they will also assess a penalty. On the other hand, if a person overpays their taxes in a given year, does the government pay interest to the taxpayer on the use of his or her money, or do they assess themselves a penalty and put it in our pockets? Not on your life. In the late 1990s, then President Bill Clinton told the American people that the federal government had $1 trillion surplus that he wanted to put in the Social Security Trust Fund to make certain that it stayed solvent through the middle of this century. What he did not say is that Social Security was in trouble then precisely because the government had been looting the Social Security Trust Fund for decades since the administration of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who opened the lockbox of the Social Security Trust Fund and began dispersing it to people all across America. Social Security funds were said and are supposed to be an offline budget item to be used for nothing other than going back to the very ones who put it there in the first place. Yet the federal government for years had been taking money out of the Social Security system and replacing that money with IOUs. Did you know that's still the case today? So allow me to summarize those times 30 years ago. The American workers put their money in the Social Security Trust Fund. The American government took that money out of the Social Security Trust Fund. Then the American taxpayers, whose dollars comprised that $1 trillion surplus, would put the money back in the Social Security Trust Fund. Perhaps a simple illustration will help. Let's say that a person had put a total of $1,000 into Social Security. The government comes along and takes that $1,000 out. Then let's say that enough people pay $1,000 in taxes so that $1 trillion surplus is created and goes into Social Security. Now, what have you got? Well, you've still got $1,000 in the Social Security Trust Fund, but you paid $2,000 to have it there. Of course, the projected $1 trillion surplus never actually materialized. And the Social Security Trust Fund still contains nothing but empty promises to put the money back. The government has a tendency to take. Someone says, yes, John, that's true, but the government also gives. Well, I agree that the government gives. However, the government can only give to one person what it has already taken from another person. Every dollar that the government will spend or give away tomorrow is money that will be taken from someone else today. The government cannot create wealth. The government can only confiscate wealth. Of course, the government can print money, that's true. But when the government prints money, that quickly devalues whatever money you may have, so that one's spending power is hugely decreased. For example, when I was given a full football scholarship in college, that scholarship was worth $16,000 over the course of 4 years. Can you imagine $16,000 for a 4-year college education? Today, you can't even go to college for 1 year on $16,000. So what does that say about what the government does to our money? Then someone may object, well, Jesus said, give to Caesar that which is Caesar's. I know he did, that's true. And I'm not saying that taxes are wrong. I realize that some taxes are necessary for an orderly society to be maintained and for our borders to be protected against foreign aggression. However, if the people of a nation fail to draw a line that cannot be transgressed by Caesar, then Caesar ultimately will take it on. But where is that line to be drawn? Well, the standard presented in 1 Samuel 8 is 10%. And even that rate, according to 1 Samuel 8, would be enough to make the people cry out. If it takes more than 10% of the people's income to run the government, then the government is too big, or the government is doing more than it has any business doing. In times of national crisis, the case can be made via other biblical passages for a 20 to 25% tax rate. However, when the crisis abates, then the percentage falls back to 10%. Of course, the case can be readily made that the government is always creating some kind of crisis that requires higher taxes. Do you remember in the 1960s that the government said the oil would be gone in 10 years? In the 1970s, the government said that an ice age would occur in 10 years. In the 1980s, the government said that acid rain would destroy our nation's crops in 10 years. In the 1990s, the government said that the ozone layer would disappear in 10 years. In the 2000s, the government said that the ice caps would vanish in 10 years, flooding the earth. Well, forgive me if I am wrong, but I don't believe the city of Miami has moved its buildings back 1 inch. I don't believe the city of New York has moved its buildings back 1 inch. Certainly that hasn't happened here in Clearwater, Florida. Well, none of these things happened, but our taxes were raised in each of those decades that have never been rescinded, and institutions established that have spent millions for no purpose at all. Listen, how would your life change if you made $60,000 per year and instead of paying $20,000 to $30,000 each year in total taxes, you only paid $6,000? Imagine having $54,000 after total taxes as opposed to $30,000 to $40,000. So first, the government has a tendency to take. Second, Samuel tells us here that the government has a tendency to dominate. Look at verse 17b in 1 Samuel 8. You yourselves will become the king's servants. Now notice the word translated servants. That is the same word used in the ancient world for household slaves. You yourselves will become the king's household slaves. Notice also the double pronouns, you yourselves, as in the emphatic position. There is the emphasis here on the loss of individual freedom. God is saying eventually human governments come to see us as working for them and belonging to them, as opposed to them working for us and belonging to us. No one knew that more clearly than the founding fathers of this nation. As a result, they produced what has got to be considered one of the most brilliant documents ever to come from the pen of man. It began with the words, "We, the people." This document guaranteed a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. Nearly 250 years later, the very government established by that document comes to us and says, do it our way or you'll receive no funds. And they deliver ultimatums about textbooks, ultimatums about school curriculums, ultimatums about health systems, ultimatums about various services, and ultimatums about sexual orientation. You cannot build a house without governmental approval of the plans, the procedure, and the final product. You cannot start a business without a permit from the government. You cannot even flush a commode without the government telling you how much water you can use to flush it. So each time you make use of the commode, you can be reminded that your tax dollars are being flushed down the toilet. You've got to have a license to drive, a license to fish, a license to hunt. You've got to buy a tag for your car, a tag for your truck, a tag for your motorcycle, a tag for your boat, and a tag for the trailer on which you drag your boat. We are even compelled to buy a tag for our dogs and cats. Our government has taken away the right of parents to spank our children. while at the same time they reserve the right to give your children contraceptives and abortions and gender-altering hormones without parental consent. Now, I may be excommunicated for saying this, but as someone recently posted, the time out generation has not turned out nearly as well as the ass-whipping generation. I grew up in the ass-whipping generation. Now, the government tells the citizens of the United States when and where they can talk about their faith, when and where they can display a Bible, when and where they can pray, all in the name of church and state separation. Would you be shocked to discover that the phrase separation of church and state appears neither in the Declaration of Independence nor the U.S. Constitution? In fact, in the first 160 years of its existence, the Supreme Court looked favorably upon the influence of Christianity in government affairs. During those 16 decades, the justices of the highest judicial body in our land interpreted the First Amendment as a protection of the church against the control or interference of the state. The First Amendment was created, at least in part, as an impenetrable wall to prevent the erection of an official church state. The Founding Fathers never meant to exclude religious affairs in the sway or in the affairs of state. Freedom of religion did not mean freedom from religion. So listen to what some of our Founding Fathers had to say. Patrick Henry wrote, "It cannot be emphasized too strongly that this great nation was founded not by religionists or pluralists, but by Christians, not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ." John Jay, contributor to the Federalist Papers and the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, wrote, "Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and interest of our nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers." James Madison, another contributor to the Federalist Papers and a two-term U.S. president, wrote, "Before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe. Religion is the basis and foundation of government." John Adams, George Washington's successor to the presidency, wrote, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion." He said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." The journals of our Founding Fathers, as well as the minutes of the first congressional sessions, are filled with accounts of how lawmakers took principles from the Bible and both voted them and wrote them into our government. Now, if these things are true, and they are, then I, for one, cannot understand why the First Amendment is so difficult to understand. Did the Founding Fathers mean for this measure to be so complicated? Consider the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Consider what it says in regard to religion. "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Now, the first clause is an establishment clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The second is an exercise clause. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, interpreted via the cultural milieu of the times in which it was written, the Establishment Clause prohibits the mandate of religion. But the exercise clause encourages the promotion of religion, any religion. However, for the founding fathers, that religion happened to be Christianity. The establishment clause means that the practice of religion cannot be forced upon anyone, but the exercise clause encourages the legitimacy of religious debate and/or religious proclamation in the public forum. The establishment clause prevents the institution of a state church in society. But the exercise clause encourages the influence of religious priorities in the guidance of civil affairs. The establishment clause says, look, I can't make you accept my religion. But the exercise clause says you can't keep me from talking about or practicing my religion. My religion may be offensive to you. It may be highly offensive to you. However, if the First Amendment means anything, it means that no law can be made at any level of society that prohibits my personal freedom to express and practice my faith. The only exceptions to freedom of religious expression are those in which the state can demonstrate a compelling interest against such expression. For instance, if my religion calls for human sacrifice or perhaps Sharia law, the state can step in and say, no, you can't sacrifice humans. No, you can't participate in honor killings, regardless of what your religion says. The state has a compelling interest to keep people alive. Here is another example. If my religion says I can burn your house down if you disagree with me, the state can step in and say, no, you can't burn down the houses of others, regardless of what your religion says. The state has a compelling interest to protect home ownership and private property. Tell that to the government officials who on the West Coast allowed mobs of people to threaten homes and burn down businesses. When the Establishment Clause is rightly seen as a prohibition against the mandate of religion rather than a restriction against the promotion of religion, then the differing facets of the First Amendment are harmonized with these. The Founding Fathers would allow for religious assembly in publicly funded schools as long as attendance at that assembly is not mandated. The Founding Fathers would allow for a teacher in a public classroom to have a Bible on his or her bookshelf as long as no student is required to read that Bible for purposes of indoctrination. The Founding Fathers would allow prayer in schools as long as participation in that prayer is voluntary. The Founding Fathers would allow the Ten Commandments to hang on a school wall, not as an encouragement for someone to ascribe either to Judaism or Christianity as a means of salvation, but rather as a guideline for civilized, orderly society. Which of those commandments would be damaging to our nation? Honor your mother and father. You shall not kill. You shall not covet. You shall not bear false witness. The Founding Fathers would allow a student to attend a religious school using government funds because he or she attends that school out of choice rather than compulsion. And I say, thank you, Ron DeSantis. The First Amendment actually promotes and encourages religion as long as that religion is not mandated. Now let me show you something. Remove the morals of religion from society, and you remove the basis for law and order as well as personal freedom. The prohibition against murder is rooted in religion. The prohibition against stealing is rooted in religion. The prohibition against bearing false witness is rooted in religion. God without man is still God, but man without God is chaos, confusion, and anarchy. The founding fathers never intended the First Amendment to be a foe of religion, but a friend. Mandate, no. Promotion, yes. So the tendency of government is to dominate. Regardless of how well-intentioned a government begins, domination is always the end. Always the end. Thomas Jefferson repeatedly said that the best government is the smallest government, that governments are not to be the masters of the people, but the servants of the people. Abraham Lincoln referred to these Jeffersonian principles as the definitions and axioms of a free society. However, during the years of the Great Depression, the federal government, the federal administration of FDR seized the opportunity to repudiate those Jeffersonian principles and redesign government that would grow ever larger and would increasingly demand the right to regulate the social and economic life of the country. You know this to be true. Since that time, the federal government has intruded into the medical arena, the educational arena, the scientific arena, the religious arena, the sexual arena, the financial arena, and much, much more. Why? Because that is the nature of the beast. The larger the government becomes, the more intrusive government becomes. Of course, there are those who feel that American life has become far too complex for individuals to handle their own affairs, much less the affairs of their communities. In his 1981 inaugural address, Ronald Reagan said, "If no one has the capacity to govern himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else?" There are responsibilities that the government is to uphold to keep lawless people in check. But lawful people have a far greater responsibility. And what is that responsibility? That responsibility is keeping the government in check. So let's draw some conclusions. First conclusion. God, not government, is the highest guarantor of freedom. Verse 18 in 1 Samuel 8 tells us that the day would come when Israel would cry out because of their king. Why the outcry? The context of the previous 7 verses tells us that it is due to the oppressive, overbearing, unreasonable demands of the government. If you want to lose your freedom, then surrender your life to the government without question and without restriction. Benjamin Franklin said rebellion against tyrants is obedience to God. He based those words on the struggle of the ancient Israelites against the tyranny of the Egyptian Pharaoh. It is no accident that in the Declaration of Independence, a document profoundly based on the Word of God, our founding fathers divorced the colonies from England's tyrannical rule based not on the rights given by government, but rather on the rights given by God. The second paragraph says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The founders of this nation recognized that rights do not belong to the government to give, but rights belong to God to give. Governments which hold the power to give rights also hold the power to take away those rights. When individual rights are in the hand of government to give, the rights of the people depend solely upon the whims and opinions of those who happen to be in power at the time. However, when individual rights come from the hand of God, then those rights are unalienable, they are inviolate, and they cannot be taken away. It is not the government's job to give those rights. It is the government's job to protect those rights. First conclusion: God, not government, is the highest and best guarantor of freedom. Conclusion number 2. People who think that government knows best and that government always has their best interests at heart are people destined to become slaves. Look at verses 19 and 20 in 1 Samuel 8. The people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. And they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, so that we also may be like all the nations. And our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." Do you know what we see in those 2 verses? We see future slaves. You see people who wanted the government to do for them what they should have been doing for themselves. We see people who were willing to surrender their best interest to the judgment of others rather than taking that judgment upon themselves. We see people who were putting their hope in human rule rather than divine rule. We see people who wanted government to give them what they had rather than a government securing their personal freedom so they could earn what they had. Third conclusion: the time ultimately comes when the ever-growing shackles of government must be thrown aside so that freedom may be reestablished. Verse 18 says, "You will cry out because of your king." In Exodus 2, verse 23, a similar verse appears. The sons of Israel groaned because of their bondage, and they cried out. May I take you back to the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence? That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government. Prudence indeed, the Declaration says, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But following a long train of abuses and usurpations, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Are you saying, John, that we should abolish our present form of government? Perhaps. But more, I am saying that it is time for government to get back to the basics. Maintaining an orderly society, protecting the rights of the citizenry, safeguarding our borders, and then getting the heck out of the way. I am saying that governments take and dominate to such a degree that the people eventually groan beneath the bondage of that government and cry out for change. It happened in the ancient world. It has happened again and again through history. It is happening now in the modern world, and it is even happening in America. And it will happen yet again anywhere governments are established. The tendencies of government are to take and to dominate. Warn them, God said to Samuel. Warn them strongly and tell them of the practice of the king who will reign over them. So what can we do? Well, we can vote. Though our voting system has become riddled with fraud, there are ways to correct that, but no one wants to hear it. We can run for public office, though getting anything accomplished in government means compromise, and compromise always leads to corruption. We can stay in touch with our senators and congressmen, and I can help you with tools to do that very thing. We can protest when and where appropriate opportunities arise. We can also pray for our nation and for our government, which is something we do right here at Countryside Baptist every Wednesday night following our time of worship. And we believe that praying makes a difference. And then if the day comes when the shackles of this government should be cast off, we can stand strong and stay the course. But who among us do you think would be willing to do that? This past weekend, I watched a documentary on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a pastor in Germany during the rise of Adolf Hitler. Bonhoeffer opposed the Nazi regime. In his 30s, he opposed it. They jailed him, and in 1945, 1 month before the end of the war, they stripped him naked and hung him until he was dead. He has written a book entitled The Cost of Discipleship. I have a copy of it in my own library. Do you suppose there are any Dietrich Bonhoeffers among us today who would give up their lives, their freedom, if it meant opposing and throwing off the shackles of a tyrannical government? I do not know. You will notice on the title slide of today's message, the greatest enemy of liberty. In each of the bottom corners is a picture. One of the White House and one of the nation's capital. It is my honest belief that the greatest enemies of liberty in our time reside in the White House and on Capitol Hill.